could spend all day, every day, making the impossible possible, wouldn't you want to? It's okay to say yes. I think that would be really fun. If someone said, hey, your job is to make impossible things possible, I would sign up. I think that that would be amazing. And my guess is there's some small part of you who goes, yeah, that would be pretty cool. So my next question is this: then why don't we all want to work at Disney World? I mean, they literally specialize in making impossible things, things that you didn't think could happen in real life, happen in real life. I mean, cartoons come out of the screen and you can interact with them. You can ride on creatures that don't actually exist. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. Why don't we all want to just go work there? The truth is, if you quit your job, if I quit mine, and we all moved down to Florida and got a job at Disney World, there would be a really steep learning curve. A lot of rules that you would have to learn and obey and carry out all day, every day as you worked in the park. And some of those rules are pretty quirky. Rules like, you can have a beard, but you can't grow one. Do the math, I don't know how it works. Other than you can't be actively growing a beard while on duty. You need to take a vacation, grow it, and come back with one. That is an actual rule. It's either a full beard that's nicely trimmed or no beard at all. Fingernails can only be 1/4 of an inch past the tip of your finger. If you're a nail biter, you're good. If you are big on the manicure thing, you're gonna have trouble. It is everyone's job to pick up trash if they see it on the floor, but you cannot bend over to pick up trash. You have to swoop and pick it up. I don't even know what that means. I looked the internet far and wide to see a YouTube video, but you are not allowed to just bend over. There is a very certain way by which you pick up trash at Disney World. A fourth rule that you would have to know is that you can't point at anything with one finger. Because in Asian countries, this is very rude. So if you're ever at Disney World, and I recommend that you find yourself there at some point in your life, a cast member, not a staff member, a cast member will never point like this. They will always point like this or this. 2-finger minimum, not one. If you point with one finger, you broke a rule, you are in trouble. Another one that I find interesting is you are not allowed to post anything about your job, what you do, or how much you even love it on social media. Those are grounds for termination if you do. Quirky rules, right? Here's what I've been thinking about. Is it possible, and those are just 5 of a bunch, but is it possible that if those were the only 5 rules and you obeyed all 5 of those rules every day that you worked at Disney World, is it possible you could still get called into your manager's office and get a bad review? Sure it is, right? You might shave your face every day and not even let stubble show up. You might perfect the act of swooping up garbage. You may forget what pointing with one finger feels like, and you could deactivate all of your social media accounts just so you're not tempted, and still your manager sits you down and says, you're obeying all the rules, but we still have an issue. You are missing it. There is an it factor when it comes to working at Disney World. There's something beyond the rules. Or at the very least, something that all of the rules point to. And if you don't get that, then all of the rules don't really matter, whether you get them wrong or get them right. You see, for Disney World, it's all about the guest. The guest rules in the Magic Kingdom. And you're supposed to do anything and everything. And so if you're grumpy and you are ruining the multi-$1,000 vacation that someone is there to have, that is a problem, no matter how nice your fingernails look. There's an it factor. They point to something. There's something beyond them. They're important, but they're not the end game. Which just helps me understand, whether it's in the workplace or even in my marriage. You can follow all the rules and still miss it. You can follow all the rules and still miss it. You can obey the handbook first page to last page, and your manager still says you have a performance issue or an attitude issue. You're missing it. The guest still felt this big when you interacted with them. Yes, you get up every morning and you make the coffee and you do the dishes and you get home on time and you tuck the kids into bed after a great story. You obey all the rules, but your marriage still feels like it's broken. You're doing all the right things, but you're still missing it. Nobody understood this principle better than a guy named Saul. You probably know him better as Paul. He was one of those that changed his name once he encountered the living Messiah, Jesus. And Saul was a very different dude before he became Paul. But when he was Saul, he would make the argument, I obeyed all of the rules. All of the things that my church, they didn't call it church when he was doing his thing, but my church, the temple, the rules of my religion, I'm obeying all of them. But he was still missing it. He was still missing what they all pointed to in the end anyway. But eventually he meets Jesus. We're gonna get to that this morning. But because of his relationship with Jesus and the things that he was saying, Paul was put on trial. The religious leaders of the day wanted him dead. Sound familiar? Seems like religious leaders go after people quite often. First Jesus, now Paul. But they have to get him into the Roman courts, and so Paul goes before Festus, who is the governor of the region. He's been empowered by Rome. And he pleads his case, and Festus listens to all the arguments, and he just finds himself scratching his head. What am I supposed to do with Paul? I mean, he's really not broken any rules. Really, no matter what kind of rules you look at, whether they're civil rules or your religious rules, he would say to the Jewish leaders of the day. I really can't find charges, let alone make a conviction on these phantom charges. I'm having a really hard time. So what Festus does is he calls his friend Agrippa II. And Agrippa comes and he gets to interview Paul and listen to Paul's arguments. And that's where we're going to jump in Acts, because this is going to be one of the 3 times Paul in his own words describes the change that took place in his life. So, Acts 26, if you're going to follow along in your own Bible. Luke, by the way, one of the writers, remember Eric talked about Luke just a few weeks back. Luke writes Acts, and so he's recording these stories, interacted with Paul all the time, knew him really well. But Paul stands before Agrippa and he says, as the Jewish leaders are well aware, this is no secret. Everybody here listening knows what I'm about to tell you about myself. This is no secret. I'm pretty much a big deal. I was given a thorough Jewish training from my earliest childhood. If they would admit it, they know that I have been a member of the Pharisees, the strictest sect of our religion. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but when we read through the Gospels and we look at the Easter story or the teachings of Jesus and the interactions with Jesus, it's usually him going up against the Pharisees. And Paul was a Pharisee. He was one of the bad guys of the day. But better said, he was one of the religious leaders of the day. And he already says, listen, a Pharisee they're the strictest sect of our religion. Pharisees were smaller groups of people that committed themselves to strictly obeying the law. Now, they had a 2-stream law that they adhered to. One was the written law, the Mosaic law that we find in the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament. But there was also the oral law or oral tradition. And the Pharisees would pass this on in their groups, and there were all kinds of God-made rules in the Torah and man-made rules that they said were equal to the written rules, and they were going to obey them to the letter, and anybody that didn't obey those rules was in trouble. You see, because what they believed, what they taught, was that the way to God, the way to a right relationship with God, the way to closeness with God, the way to knowing God is by obeying all the rules. If you obey all the rules, then you get to be close to God. And Paul knew all the rules. Paul obeyed all the rules. And in a minute, you're going to see he even went so far as to make everybody else obey all the rules. You see, in the end, we can say without a doubt that Paul was very religious. He was very, very religious. In fact, if you had bumped into him at the local coffee shop in the Middle East back in the first century, and you struck up a conversation with him, and you said, "Hey, are you a person of faith? Are you religion?" Paul would say, well, I'm very religious. Have you ever had that said to you? Maybe you've said that, right? Like, we love to tell, I'm very religious. And what do we usually mean when we say things like, I am very religious? I go to church a lot. Because the inverse of that is usually people will say, I'm not very religious. I don't go to church regularly. We associate religion with rules, with do's, don'ts, and check boxes. But if there were anybody that was very religious, it was Paul. He knew the rules, obeyed the rules, made everybody else obey the rules too. He goes on to say this from that point. Now I'm on trial because of my hope in the fulfillment of God's promise made to our ancestors. They share the same hope I have. This is very interesting to me because Paul's contention, or the religious leaders' contention with Paul, is not about the rules. It's not about the 10 Commandments. It's not about the written law, the oral law, or any of that stuff. Paul says the argument here, the problem here, is that we disagree on God's promises. We disagree on God's fulfillment of the promises. Now, if I'm sitting in the crowd and I'm rooting for Paul, I'm going, is that the best strategy? Paul, is it really the best strategy to try and reframe the argument, or should you just lean into the argument? I mean, you are like a religious superhero. Why not just argue them into the ground? I did this, I go there, I give this, I say this, I obey all the rules. You got nothing on me. And the judge would go, case closed, let him out. But Paul doesn't even go there. He says, I want to talk about the hope. And in case you haven't caught it, my hope is your hope. And when he's talking to your hope, he's talking about the religious leaders. He says, listen, all of the laws that you obey, all of the writings of the prophets that are so precious to you, they're about the very thing that I believe in, that I'm professing, that I'm on trial for. But you are missing it. You see, the reality is, Paul is not on trial for mistaken religion. He has not been brought before Festus or Agrippa because he got some religious point wrong. Paul is on trial for misplaced hope. They agree. Every Pharisee in the room agrees with the Pharisee Paul about what the rules are, how important they are, and how necessary they are. But what they can't buy is that all of it was all about Jesus. The Jesus that they crucified. The Jesus whose body is still missing. And Paul comes along and he says, listen, all of it is about him. And that is why he's on trial. You see, what the Pharisees want to do is they want to make this a black and white issue. It's either or. You are either a practicing, diligent, vigilant Jewish Pharisee, or you are a dirty, rotten sinner full of blasphemy that needs to be excommunicated or better, put to death. That's the goal for them. It's one of those two things. And then some people would come along and go, you're right, it's not a black and white issue. For Paul, it would be a gray issue. But I'm going to make the argument that it's not even a gray issue. It's not wishy-washy for Paul. This isn't like let's all hold hands and just think whatever we want to think and not be mad at each other. It's better than that for Paul. For Paul, this is a technicolor neon concept. And it has one truth. You see, for Paul, this is not about what the rules are. This is about what the rules are about. This is why they exist. This is what they've been pointing to and leading us toward all along. Toward a cross where someone paid the price for our sins once and for all. All of our misdeeds, all of our wrongdoings, all of our ugly, that the law would point out to us and that we would need to make payment for. Jesus paid it all. You see, Paul would say, we're missing it. And what's so cool about Paul is he would say, but don't feel too bad, because I was missing it too. This is what he says. He says, I caused many believers there to be sent to prison. And I cast my vote against them when they were condemned to death. You see, when he makes the statement, I cast my vote against them, it's very likely that Paul was a part of the Supreme Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin was the Jewish word for tribunal. And anybody that was found guilty of breaking religious rules or religious law would be brought before the Sanhedrin and they would try them. And they would find you either innocent of breaking the rules or guilty of breaking the rules. And if you were guilty of breaking the rules, you would go to prison or you would be put to death. And the Sanhedrin was not a government body. It was a religious body. And given that Paul was part of the Sanhedrin, it means that he was part of the group that interpreted the law and executed the law, carried out the law. He was all of those things. He was all about the rules. You see, religion is always about following the rules. Now, before we have any misunderstanding, the argument being made today by myself or Paul is not that there are no rules. It's not that there aren't things that we should be doing or refraining from doing. It's understanding what the rules are all about. Because there have been generations after generations that identified codes that they were going to live by all day, every day, and they still missed it. And I don't think that once the Pharisee sect went away, that went away. And here's how I know. For me, this has been the definition of my Christianity. Christianity has always been, for me, about following the rules. I either do or I don't. If I do, I'm good. If I don't, I'm bad. And if I don't, God doesn't like me. But the reality is, I never was following the rules, and God still liked me, loved me, and sent Jesus for me. So it's not that there aren't rules. It's that there's something beyond the rules. There's something the rules point to that's better than the rules. From there, Paul starts to describe his encounter with Jesus. An encounter that was not a dream, one that actually happened, that there were witnesses to testify to. And this is how he says it went down. The bright light comes from heaven. Saul, Saul. I, by the way, totally believe that Jesus said it just like that. I don't think it was like, Saul, Saul. I think it was Saul. Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul would have gone, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just going after the Christians. I don't have any problem with you. I just have a problem with the rule breakers, and I'm just doing the right thing here. I'm just living into my religion. I'm not doing anything to you. Jesus goes on to say, it's useless for you to fight against my will. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Because Jesus doesn't talk about rules, he doesn't talk about commandments, he doesn't talk about law, whether it's written or spoken. Who does he talk about? Me. He talks about Jesus. That this, I am the point. And when you persecute them, you're persecuting me. So everything that you have an issue with them about, you have an issue with me about. And this is the interesting part at the end when it says it's useless to fight against my will. The phrase he uses there is this useless to kick against the goads. Now we don't use that much, but it's a cattle term. A goad was a stick with something very sharp on the end of it, and it was a means by which you would get cattle to move. Now here's where I start scratching my head. Paul, totally religious, knows the rules, follows the rules, gets others to follow the rules. Jesus meets him on the road that he's on to go help people in Damascus, understand their problem. And Jesus comes and he says, you are kicking against the goads in being so religious right now. That's the part where I go, are you allowed to say that out loud? Jesus? Paul's just trying to do the right thing. I mean, it was you that gave us the Ten Commandments. It was you that gave us the law. This is what Saul would argue. If you're God, then you gave us this. Why wouldn't you want me to go about it? And I think Jesus says, because you're missing it. You're missing me. I am my will for you. I am my will for all. And if you continue to go down this road that you're going down, you're going in the wrong direction. You're kicking against the goads, and it is useless for you to fight against my will. You see, what Paul learns in this moment is that you can follow all the rules and still miss it. And so what does Jesus say? Jesus then goes on to give him a mission. He commissions him to go out to not the Jewish people that he'd been hunting down and imprisoning, but to go to the Gentiles, which would have been even crazier to a Jewish person. You want me to go interact with these unclean, unreligious people and tell them that you love them and that you offer them forgiveness for their sin? This is what Jesus says. Tell people that you have seen me, and tell them what I will show you in the future. I think it's so fascinating that Jesus says, here's what I want you to tell them. Tell them that you saw me. Tell them that you saw it. The point, the reason, the end game. That you're not missing it anymore. It literally stopped you in your tracks on the road, and it is Jesus. The only way that you will see it and understand all of it and what it's all about and why it exists in the first place is when you see Jesus. And what we learn right here between the kicking against the goads and this mission to tell people you've seen me, you've found it, the thing we've been waiting for, the one we've been waiting for. I believe that Jesus is saying that Jesus is different from religion. I have one of those jobs where when people ask me what I do, I get very nervous. I've literally been at parties where people have changed seats. And you know why? Because they're very worried about religious people, especially one who gets paid to be religious. And I know you've probably heard this before, that Christianity is not religion, it's a relationship. And you know why we say that all the time? Because it's true. It's not religion. It's a relationship. It's why Jesus says, go and tell people that you saw me. Me. Don't fight against my will. Don't persecute me. This is all about Jesus. What Paul learns is that the rules are a means to an end, not the end. And we should never get those two things confused. That the rules are meant to protect a relationship, to continue a relationship. But the cross, the message of the cross is that the relationship begins and ends with Jesus. And so from the moment Paul meets Jesus on the road, he changes entirely how he does it. And the religious people started throwing rocks at him. The religious people continually threw him in jail. Do you know why? Because he's messing with their religion. And it's not neat and nice and black and white anymore. It's this new blinding light named Jesus. And this is what Paul starts to write. He writes this over and over again in a number of letters, but this one's in his letter to the Christians in Rome. He says, God's shown us a way to be right with him. Get this. Can you imagine how unsettling these next words would be? Made a way to be right with him without keeping the requirements of the law. He goes on to say, we are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. No wonder they threw rocks at him. No wonder they plotted to kill him. No wonder they had to get him on trial and try and get him out of the picture because he's talking crazy. Remember what a Pharisee believes. You are made right with God by keeping the rules. And Paul comes along and he says, no, you can be made right with God without keeping the law. You just need to have faith in Jesus. That would have messed a lot of people up. It still messes a lot of people up. Because me, as a Christian, the truth is, if there were still Pharisees, I'd probably want to be one. Because I like rules. I like boundaries. I feel more free in a fenced-in yard than a wide-open field. I don't know what to do with that space. So it's hard for me. It makes me want to go, Jesus, that's too easy. But here's what it means. And I hope that for all of us, this is life-giving. I hope for each of us, this is foundation shaking so that we re-engage with our faith again and start wrestling with this relationship that we call Christianity. Here's the summation of Paul's experience in his writing. Your relationship with God isn't based on your ability to follow rules. If that were the case, Jesus didn't need to come. There didn't need to be a cross. Your relationship with God is not based on your ability to follow rules, because if it were based on your ability to follow rules, then your hope, your redemption, your wholeness, your forgiveness is based on you. And if it's based on me, I'm in big trouble, because I will let me down every time. The truth is, your relationship with God is based on your willingness to follow Jesus. And I know that some of us here are going like, what's the difference? About as wide as you can possibly imagine is the difference. People died for this truth. Paul died for this truth. Matthew died for this truth. John got exiled for this truth. That you're made right with God based on your willingness to follow Jesus, not your ability to follow rules. Now here's what's so amazing, is that from there it begins to affect, if that's the truth of the most important and biggest relationship in our life, it starts to permeate into every other relationship in our lives. And here's what I think it tells us. Your relationship with others isn't based on their ability to follow the rules either. Because here's what we do. We categorize people. We do just like the Pharisees, and we have a bucket for the good Christians, and we have a bucket for everybody else. And what's crazy is some of us good Christians, myself included, put some just Christians in the other bucket because they're not as good as us. And we've created this grading scale and this rubric for what it means to be a Christian. And we keep some people at arm's length or avoid them altogether. But your relationship with them isn't based on their ability to follow the rules that they don't even know exist. It's harder than that. And I know what you think I'm going to say, but it's not. Your relationship with others is based on your willingness to follow Jesus. Did you get that? It doesn't say your relationship with others is based on their willingness to follow Jesus. It's based on your willingness to follow Jesus. That's the message of the cross. We had nothing to give him. Paul would go so far as to say, you and I were enemies of God. We're so against him, and yet he still came and did what he did for us on our behalf. And so when it comes to loving other people, treating other people how Jesus treated us, it just means we turn and look at Jesus and follow him. It's the whole thing. The rules all point to him. We have to refuse to miss the forest for the trees. It's one of those things as a kid, I never understood what was being said. And here's what's cool about that phrase. The trees are important because they make up the forest. But don't miss the big picture. Here's how Paul would say it in that same letter to Rome. He said, some of us are refusing to accept God's way. They cling to their own way of getting right with God by trying to keep the law. They're just persevering. They're just pushing forward. Did you know that you can still get lost in the woods by following a path? Have you ever done that? I mean, you pick the wrong path and you're going to be going, I'm legit lost. Like my dad always reminded me, lost is when you don't know where you are. It's something entirely different to not know how to get where you're going, but to have no idea where you are. I had a small taste of this. Seriously, this week I just started walking on this path. I'd never seen it before. It was in a neighborhood just across the street from mine, and I'm walking and I get into the woods and I'm like, I hope they can find somebody to preach because I am never getting out of here. Is this still Illinois? I mean, I felt like I was in the jungle. And I followed this path for what felt like forever. I was just going to push through. Not every path leads to the right place. But here's what's interesting. Jesus would say the rules or the law, they're leading you somewhere. The problem is you just didn't know where. This is how he put it. Jesus says in Matthew's account of his life, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself." And this is what he says last. The entire law, all 600 some odd laws, and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. If the rules are not pushing you to love God more or love others more, we're missing it. We're missing the heart of Jesus. Because we can follow all the rules and still miss it. I'm learning this in my person-to-person relationships. I mentioned it at the start of the discussion, but when it comes to marriage or even friendship, right, there are all kinds of unspoken, agreed-upon rules. And if you follow them, they say it'll all go well. You Google it. You will find blog after blog, website after website that says 10 rules for a healthy marriage, 10 rules for a great workplace, 10 rules for the best friend you ever had. And some of us read those and go, I do all those things, but there's still something off. If that's true in our relationship with people, I believe it can be true in our relationship with God. And if we put the rules before the point of the rules, we're missing it. We have bought into religion instead of a relationship with a God who loves us more than we can possibly imagine. Even in our darkest moment, think about how dark Paul's moments were. Literally putting his stamp of approval on the execution of Christians. And Jesus still finds him on the road and says, you've been missing it, but here it is. Follow me, and I'll get you home. Will you pray with me? Jesus, I feel like I need to say first how often I have reduced our relationship to a set of principles and checkboxes. And Lord, I will admit to you that there have been several moments where I feel like I've checked them all and still felt distant from you. Still felt like I was missing you. And I just feel so convicted by Paul's story and the things that he wrote. Because I allowed rules and rubrics to get in the way of me just loving you with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I allowed that to get in the way of me loving people the way that you loved them, and the way that you loved me, and you loved me before I kept one rule. And my guess is, Jesus, that I'm not the only one here today thinking about that. Will you please forgive us? Will you please meet us this week on the road? Because we're all following paths that we think are going to lead to more happiness, more contentment, more money, more religion. But we just want you. We just want you. Because all of it points to you anyway. So help us to see you and to follow you well. Lord, help us to love you and love our neighbor. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.